In this episode, we begin looking at a topic that helps risk management feel much more alive, because it shifts the conversation from general exposure to the specific ways real harm can develop around systems, data, people, and business processes. For new learners, threat modeling can sound like something reserved for advanced security architects, while the threat landscape can sound like a giant pile of headlines about hackers, ransomware, and new vulnerabilities. The truth is much more practical than that. The Certified in Risk and Information Systems Control (C-RISC) perspective uses both ideas to help organizations understand what kinds of harmful events are plausible, why those events matter, and how business context shapes what deserves attention first. When you can connect the larger threat environment to the way a specific organization operates, you begin moving from broad concern to disciplined analysis. And that is exactly where meaningful risk assessment starts to become useful. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good place to begin is by separating the two core ideas in the title because they are related but not identical. The threat landscape is the broader environment of potential dangers surrounding an organization, including threat actors, common attack patterns, technology trends, criminal activity, operational weaknesses, geopolitical pressure, and changes in business dependency that can create new exposure. Threat modeling is a more focused activity that asks how specific threats could affect a particular system, process, service, or business objective. In simple terms, the threat landscape is the big weather pattern, while threat modeling is the effort to understand how that weather might hit your house, your road, and your daily routine. A company does not need to worry equally about every threat in the world, but it does need to understand which kinds of threats are relevant to its own business model, technology environment, data types, and operational dependencies. That is why these two ideas belong together in risk work, because one provides the outside view and the other provides the inside application. The threat landscape matters because risk does not exist in a vacuum and because exposure changes over time even when the organization itself has not changed very much. Attackers adapt, criminal markets shift, new technologies are adopted, third-party relationships grow more complex, and social engineering techniques keep evolving because people remain a common point of weakness. At the same time, some threats are not malicious at all. Weather events, supply chain disruptions, software failures, accidental misconfigurations, insider mistakes, and unstable dependencies can all create major damage without any attacker sitting behind a keyboard. A beginner sometimes hears the word threat and thinks only of cybercrime, but risk professionals learn to use the term more broadly. A threat is anything capable of causing harm to the organization's objectives, which means the threat landscape includes malicious actors, operational breakdowns, and environmental disruptions alike. That wider view is important because a mature assessment process should capture what is plausible and meaningful, not only what is dramatic or popular in the news. Threat modeling becomes valuable when the organization needs to move from broad awareness into specific thinking about how harm could occur. It is not just a brainstorming session where people name scary possibilities. At its best, threat modeling is a structured way of asking what needs protection, who or what could harm it, how that harm could happen, what conditions make it easier, and what business consequences would follow if the event succeeded. The focus stays on realistic paths to damage rather than vague anxiety. For example, if a company relies heavily on online ordering, the model should consider threats to availability, payment integrity, customer data, identity systems, vendor dependency, and recovery capability, because those are directly tied to business success. If a hospital relies on accurate patient records and uninterrupted clinical systems, the model must think about very different outcomes, even if some of the technologies overlap. This is what makes threat modeling useful for risk management. It connects threat thinking to organizational reality instead of leaving it at the level of abstract security concern. One of the first practical lessons in threat modeling is that you have to know what matters before you can reason clearly about what threatens it. That means identifying important assets, but not only in the narrow sense of hardware and software. Important assets also include business processes, sensitive data, decision-making systems, customer trust, contractual commitments, operational capacity, and the people who make services work. A technical team might focus immediately on servers, applications, and cloud platforms, but a risk-oriented view asks what those systems are supporting and why the business depends on them. A payroll application matters because employees must be paid accurately and on time. A customer portal matters because revenue, service delivery, and reputation may all depend on it. A shared identity service matters because it can affect dozens of connected systems at once. When you begin with what the organization values, threat modeling becomes more disciplined because you are not just naming possible attacks. You are tracing possible harm against things the business truly needs to protect. Once important assets and objectives are visible, the next question is who or what might threaten them. This is where the idea of threat actors becomes useful, although not every threat is a person. Threat actors may include cybercriminals seeking money, insiders acting carelessly or maliciously, competitors trying to gain advantage, activists trying to disrupt operations, or nation-state groups pursuing strategic goals. Beyond actors, the organization must also think about system failures, vendor outages, natural disasters, human error, and process weaknesses that can trigger damaging events without deliberate malice. Each type of threat behaves differently and brings different motivations, methods, and likely targets. A financially motivated criminal may care about payment systems, identity compromise, or extortion opportunities, while a careless employee may expose data through weak handling practices or poor judgment under time pressure. The key idea for beginners is that the identity of the threat helps explain the nature of the risk. Different threats do not only increase the chance of harm, they also shape what kind of harm is most likely and what warning signs the organization should pay attention to. Another major part of threat modeling is understanding pathways, which means thinking through how a threat could move from opportunity to impact. This is where many learners begin to see why the process is more useful than simply reading a list of threats. A threat model asks how a harmful event could actually happen in this environment rather than assuming that every weakness leads to the same kind of danger. An attacker might reach a system through stolen credentials, a trusted vendor connection, exposed administrative access, or a careless employee responding to a fraudulent message. A non-malicious failure might spread through poor change control, missing validation, weak backups, or fragile integration between systems. Thinking about pathways also reveals where detection may be weak, where escalation may be slow, and where the organization may have few recovery options once the event begins. This helps turn security thinking into risk thinking, because it connects the starting point of the threat to the likely business consequences rather than treating every issue as a disconnected technical flaw. At this point, it becomes easier to see why the threat landscape and threat modeling should never be separated from business context. Organizations sometimes react strongly to whatever threat is receiving the most public attention, but risk professionals must ask whether that threat is truly relevant to the organization's actual exposure. A small manufacturing firm, a regional hospital, a financial services provider, and a software company may all read about the same emerging attack trend. Yet the realistic impact and likelihood can differ greatly depending on their systems, customers, obligations, and dependencies. Threat modeling helps avoid the mistake of chasing every headline equally. It encourages the organization to ask where it is exposed, what conditions make that exposure plausible, and how serious the result would be if the threat succeeded. This is especially important for C-risk learners, because the exam often rewards the answer that aligns risk thinking with business reality rather than the answer that sounds the most technically sophisticated. Good risk work is not about admiring the latest threat. It is about understanding whether that threat can meaningfully affect the organization's objectives. A useful way to understand the threat landscape is to think of it as dynamic rather than fixed. New technologies create new dependencies. Legacy systems linger longer than expected. Mergers change the environment, remote work shifts access patterns, and third-party services become woven into everyday operations. At the same time, attackers learn from each other, criminal services become easier to buy, and ordinary employees are exposed to more convincing fraud than ever before. That means the landscape today is never exactly the same as it was last year. even if many familiar threat categories remain in place. For beginners, this is an important correction to the idea that threat knowledge can be memorized once and then treated as complete. Threat understanding requires ongoing attention because relevance changes as business conditions change. A company that adopts a new cloud platform, expands into new markets, depends on a single vendor, or stores a larger volume of regulated data has changed its exposure even before any incident occurs. Threat modeling must therefore be revisited over time so the organization can keep pace with both internal change and external pressure. Threat modeling also helps uncover assumptions, and this is one of its most valuable strengths in risk assessment. Many organizations carry unspoken beliefs that shape decisions without ever being examined clearly. Teams may assume a vendor connection is well controlled, assume a backup will restore quickly, assume users can spot fraudulent messages, or assume a monitoring process is catching suspicious behavior in time. When a threat model is done thoughtfully, these assumptions begin to surface because people are forced to ask how an event would really unfold and what would happen if expected safeguards failed. That kind of questioning is extremely useful because serious incidents often expose assumptions that were never tested under realistic pressure. A risk model that simply says a control exists is much weaker than one that asks whether the control works consistently, whether it covers the whole pathway to harm, and whether the organization can still recover if the control is bypassed. Threat modeling sharpens judgment by making hidden confidence visible, which is often the first step toward reducing exposure in a meaningful way. It is also important to understand what threat modeling is not, because misconceptions can make the topic seem harder or narrower than it really is. It is not a guarantee that the organization will predict every future attack, and it is not only for software developers or technical architects. It is not an exercise in creating the most frightening worst-case story, and it is not a one-time document that gets written and then forgotten in a folder. At a practical level, it is a disciplined way of thinking through plausible harm so the organization can prioritize attention more intelligently. That means business owners, security professionals, operations teams, legal advisors, and technology staff may all have useful insight depending on the subject being analyzed. The strength of the process comes from combining perspectives, because technical teams know system behavior, business teams know process dependency, and leadership knows what outcomes matter most. When these views are brought together, the model becomes far more grounded than if it were built from a single narrow perspective. Examples make the topic much easier to understand. Imagine a retailer that depends on online sales during a seasonal peak. The threat landscape around that retailer might include ransomware, credential theft, payment fraud, vendor outages, and denial of service attempts, along with accidental misconfigurations during fast-moving system changes. A useful threat model would not simply list those dangers. It would ask how a customer account compromise could lead to fraud and trust loss, how a disruption in payment processing could affect revenue, how a supplier dependency could magnify downtime, and how weak monitoring during weekends could allow a small issue to grow into a major event before the right team responds. In a different setting, such as healthcare, the model might focus more heavily on patient safety, clinical continuity, privacy obligations, and data integrity because those are the areas where harm becomes most serious. The examples differ, but the method is the same. Start with what matters, consider what threatens it, trace plausible paths to harm, and connect the result to business impact. From a C-risk perspective, the real value of this topic is that it improves the quality of later analysis and decision-making. When threat modeling is done well, the organization can identify more meaningful risk events, understand contributing conditions more clearly, and build better risk scenarios for assessment and reporting. It becomes easier to explain why a control weakness matters, why a dependency deserves attention, or why one threat should be prioritized over another. That helps leaders avoid both overreaction and complacency. Instead of treating every finding as equally urgent or every familiar system as automatically safe, they can make more reasoned decisions based on how threats interact with business reality. This is also why threat modeling supports communication so well. It gives risk professionals a clearer story to tell, one that links the outside threat environment to the specific ways the organization could experience loss, disruption, or legal and reputational harm if the wrong conditions line up at the wrong time. By the end of this discussion, the big picture should feel much more practical than the title may have suggested at first. The threat landscape describes the wider environment of possible danger, while threat modeling helps the organization understand how those dangers could affect its own systems, processes, data, and objectives in concrete terms. Strong threat modeling begins with what the business values, considers who or what could cause harm, examines likely pathways, challenges assumptions, and keeps pace with changing conditions over time. It avoids the trap of generic fear and replaces it with disciplined reasoning that supports better assessment, better prioritization, and better communication. That is why this topic matters so much in Domain 2. When you understand both the broader threat environment and the specific ways harm can unfold inside an organization, you are not just studying threats as an abstract category. You are learning how to think like a risk professional who can connect real-world danger to real-world business consequences with clarity and judgment.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.